Tlilil in Tlapal, the red and black ink. Meso-America, Chapter 1, Anahuac, year 2070.
We were perpetual slaves to white supremacy for 560 years. And before we know where we will be, we need to know where we've been. Let's rewind to a civilization collapsed without the stain of Eurocentricity. Before we rewind to the beginning, an Eurocentric diffusionism.
By David Easton. Section 1. Before Columbus. The main islands were thickly populated with a peaceful folk when Christ found them.
But the orgy of blood which followed, no man has written. We are the slaughterers. It is the tortured soul of our world. William Carlos Williams. Chapter 1. It's gone now, drained and desiccated in the aftermath of the Spanish conquest. But once there was an interconnected complex of lakes high up in the Valley of Mexico that was as long and as wide as the city of London is today. Surrounding these waters, known collectively as the Lake of the Moon, were scores of towns and cities whose population, combined with that of the outlying communities of central Mexico, totaled about 25 million men, women, and children. On any given day, as many as 200,000 small boats moved back and forth on the Lake of the Moon, pursuing the interests of commerce, political intrigue, and simple pleasure. The southern part of the Lake of the Moon was filled with brilliantly clear spring-fed water, but the northern part, in the rainy season, became brackish and sometimes inundated the southern region with an invasion of destructive salty currents. So the people of the area built a 10-mile-long stone and clay masonry dike separating the lower third of the lake from the upper two-thirds, blocking the saltwater when it appeared, but through an ingenious loose use of sluice gates, allowing the heavy water traffic on the lake to continue its rounds unobstructed by the massive levee wall. This southern part of the Great Lake thus became, as well as a thoroughfare, an immense freshwater fish pond. In the middle of this freshwater part of the lake, there were two reed-covered mud banks that the residents of the area over time had built up and developed into a single huge island as large as Manhattan. And upon that island, the people built a metropolis that became one of the largest cities in the world. With a conventionally estimated population of about 350,000 residents by the end of the 15th century, this teeming Aztec capital already had at least 5 times the population of either London or Seville, and was vastly larger than any other European city. Moreover, according to Hernando Cortés, one of the first Europeans to set eyes upon it, it was far and away the most beautiful city on earth. The name of this magnificent metropolis was Tenochtitlan. It stood, majestic and radiant, in the crisp clean air, 7,200 feet above sea level, connected to the surrounding mainland by 3 wide causeways that had been built across miles of open water. To view Tenochtitlan from a distance, all who had the opportunity to do so agreed, was breathtaking. Before arriving at the great central city, travelers from afar had to pass through the densely populated, seemingly infinite surrounding lands. And already, invariably, they were overwhelmed. Wrote Cortez's famous companion and chronicler, Bernal Diaz del Castillo, of their visit to one of the provincial cities at the confluence of Lake Janco and Lake Xochimilco. When we entered the city of Iztapalapa, the appearance of the palaces in which they housed us, how spacious and well-built they were, of beautiful stonework and cedar wood, and the wood of other sweet-scented trees, with great rooms and courts, wonderful to behold, covered with awnings of cotton cloth. When we had looked at all of this, we went to the orchard and garden, which was such a wonderful thing to see and walk in, that I was never tired of looking at the diversity of the trees, and noting the scent which each one had, and the paths full of roses and flowers, and the native fruit trees and native roses, and the pond of fresh water. But there was another thing to observe, that great canoes were able to pass into the garden from the lake through an opening that had been made so that there was no need for their occupants to land. And all was cemented and very splendid with many kinds of stone monuments with pictures on them, which gave much to think about. Then the birds of many kinds and breeds which came into the pond. I say again that I stood looking at it and thought that never in the world would there be discovered lands such as these. Impressive as Iztapalapa was, the Spanish were seeking the heart of the great empire, so they pressed on. In addition to the cities that surrounded the Lake of the Moon, other towns were, like Tenochtitlan, built on smaller islands within it. As they neared the area that would take them to Tenochtitlan, Bernal Diaz wrote, "When we saw so many cities and villages built in the water, and other great towns built on dry land in that straight and level causeway going towards Tenochtitlan, we were amazed and said that it was like the enchantments they tell of in the legend of Amadis, on account of the great towers and temples and buildings rising from the water, and all built of masonry. Yet some of our soldiers even asked whether the things that we saw were not a dream." Finally, they reached one of the causeways leading directly to Tenochtitlan. They pushed their way across it, although it was so crowded with people that there was hardly room for them all, some of them going to and others returning from Tenochtitlan, said Bernal Diaz. Once in the city itself, they were greeted by the Aztec ruler Montezuma and taken to the top of one of the temples, and from that vantage point, they were afforded an almost aerial view of the surroundings through which they had just marched. One could see over everything very well, Bernal Diaz wrote, and we saw the three causeways which led into Tenochtitlan, that is the causeway of Iztapalapa, by which we had entered 4 days before, and out of Tacuba, and out of Tepeaquilla. And we saw the fresh water that comes from Chapultepec, which supplies the city, and we saw the bridges on the three causeways which were built at certain distances apart, through which the water of the lake flowed in and out from one side to the other. And we beheld on that great lake a multitude of canoes, some coming with supplies of food, and others returning with cargoes of merchandise. And we saw that from every house of that great city, and of all the other cities that were built in the water, it was impossible to pass from house to house, except by drawbridges which were made of wood, or in canoes. Then we saw in those cities temples and oratories like towers and fortresses, and all gleaming white, and it was a wonderful thing to behold. About 60,000 pale stucco houses filled the island metropolis, some of them single-story structures, some of them multi-story, and all these houses, wrote Cortez, have very large and very good rooms, and also very pleasant gardens of various sorts of flowers both on the upper and lower floors. The many streets and boulevards of the city were so neat and well swept, despite its multitude of inhabitants, that the first Europeans to visit never tired of remarking on the city's cleanliness and order. They were even officials in charge of sweeping, be called one-odd observer. In fact, at least 1,000 public workers were employed to maintain the city's streets and keep them clean and watered. Crisscrossed with a complex network of canals, Tenochtitlan in this respect reminded the Spanish of an enormous Venice. But it also had remarkable floating gardens that reminded them of nowhere else on earth. And while European cities then, and for centuries thereafter, took their drinking water from the fetid and polluted rivers nearby, Tenochtitlan's drinking water came from springs deep within the mainland and was piped into the city by a huge aqueduct system that amazed Cortez and his men, just as they were astonished also by the personal cleanliness and hygiene
The year is 2070, and we are liberated people.
Free to rebuild our Anahuac civilizations in the mirror of our pre-colonized people. Free to dedicate our time in conceiving and inventing tech, engineering, calendars, agriculture, philosophy, art, that benefits humanity as a collective. And most important, white supremacy is dead. The year is 2070, and this is a liberated Anahuac. This is under construction, but an overall vision of my comic book. Subscribe and follow for Chapter 2. The 5 Sacred Sons of Anahuac.